The Arizona Territory didn't forgive mistakes. Grace had learned that within her first week, watching the landscape turn from something resembling civilization into an endless stretch of dust, rock, and heat that could kill a person 6 different ways before sunset. She'd been warned back in Kansas City. A woman traveling alone into frontier country was asking for trouble. But trouble had already found her in Boston, and at least this kind came with honest intentions, even if those intentions involved robbing you blind or leaving your bones for the vultures. The stagecoach hit another rut, and Grace's shoulder slammed against the window frame. She bit back a curse that would have scandalized her former colleagues at the Pemberton Academy for Young Ladies. That life felt like someone else's memory now. The pressed linens, the afternoon teas, the carefully modulated conversations that never said anything real. She'd traded all of it for a leather bag, a teaching certificate that might mean nothing out here, and a one-way ticket to a town she'd only seen on a map. Across from her sat a mining surveyor named Hutchins, who'd spent the last 40 miles explaining the difference between various types of ore in excruciating detail. Grace had stopped listening somewhere around Argentiferous Galena. Beside him, a younger man, couldn't have been more than 20, clutched a Bible and stared out the window with the fixed expression of someone trying not to be sick. "You got people in Tucson?" Hutchins asked, not for the first time. "A position," Grace said. "Teaching post." "They're expecting you?" "They will be." It wasn't quite a lie. She'd sent a letter 6 weeks ago, had received no response, but that didn't mean much. Mail moved slow out here, when it moved at all. The position had been advertised in a Boston newspaper. Teacher needed for growing territorial settlement, room and board provided, inquire with the Office of Territorial Education. She'd written that night, packed the next morning, and tried not to think about what she'd do if the job didn't exist anymore. The young man with the Bible finally spoke. "Miss, you shouldn't be out here alone." Grace smiled thinly. "And yet, here I am. It's just, there's been trouble. Bandits working the southern routes. They hit a coach last month near Wilcox, killed the driver, took everything valuable." "Tommy, you're scaring the lady," Hutchins said, though his hand drifted to something in his coat pocket. "I'm not scared," Grace said, and was surprised to find it mostly true. She'd been scared for the last 3 years, scared of discovery, of judgment, of the slow suffocation of a life that looked perfect from the outside while rotting from within. This kind of fear, the immediate physical kind, was almost refreshing in its simplicity. "I'm careful, there's a difference." Tommy didn't look convinced, but he went back to his Bible, lips moving silently. The afternoon sun hammered down on the coach roof, turning the interior into an oven. Grace's dress stuck to her back. Her carefully pinned hair felt like a wool cap, and the dust worked its way into everything. Her eyes, her throat, the folds of her clothes. She'd dressed for respectability when she left Kansas City, but respectability was a luxury out here. What she needed was practicality, and she was learning that lesson the hard way. The driver shouted something unintelligible, and the coach began to slow. "Why are we stopping?" Grace leaned toward the window, but all she could see was more desert, the same scrub brush and rock formations that had defined the last 100 miles. "Might be the relay station," Hutchins said, but he didn't sound certain. The coach came to a full stop. Silence rushed in, the kind of silence that felt wrong, too complete. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. Then the shooting started. The first bullet punched through the coach wall 6 inches from Grace's head. She threw herself to the floor, her mind trying to catch up with what was happening. More gunfire, rapid and close. The driver screamed, a sound that cut off too quickly. Something heavy hit the ground outside. "Get down!" Hutchins yelled, though Grace was already wedged between the seats, her heart slamming against her ribs. Tommy was crying, still clutching his Bible. Hutchins had a pistol out. When had he drawn it? And was trying to see through the window without making himself a target. "How many?" Grace asked, surprised her voice worked. "Can't tell. At least 4, maybe more." Hutchins fired twice through the window, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. "They got Murphy. The driver's dead. Dead." The words sat there, flat and final. Grace had never seen anyone die before. The closest she'd come was her father's funeral, but that had been sanitized, civilized, the body already prepared and the violence of death hidden away. This was different. This was real. Another bullet tore through the roof. Tommy screamed. "We have to do something," Grace said. "We're doing it. We're staying alive." Hutchins fired again. They want the strong box. We give them the strong box. Maybe they let us go. And if they don't? Hutchins didn't answer. The gunfire intensified, coming from multiple directions now. Grace could hear voices shouting in English and Spanish, could smell gun smoke and something else. The copper tang of blood, maybe? Or just her own fear. She'd come west looking for a new life, but she hadn't planned on it being this short. She closed her eyes, tried to think. Her father had always said she had a good mind for solving problems, back when he'd still been sober enough to notice her. But he'd meant mathematics, logic puzzles, the kind of problems with clear solutions. What was the solution here? They were outnumbered, outgunned, stuck in a wooden box that offered about as much protection as paper. Something changed in the pattern of gunfire. The shots aimed at the coach stopped, redirected elsewhere. Grace risked raising her head enough to see through the window. A rider had appeared on the ridge to the east, a single man on a paint horse, silhouetted against the brutal sun. Even at this distance, she could see he was young, couldn't have been much past 25. He wore a battered hat and rode like someone who'd been born in the saddle. He also had a rifle, and he knew how to use it. The stranger fired 3 times in rapid succession. One of the bandits dropped. The others scattered, trying to find cover in terrain that offered precious little. The rider spurred his horse forward, closing the distance with a recklessness that Grace would have called suicidal if it wasn't working. "Who the hell is that?" Hutchins breathed. Grace didn't answer. She was too busy watching the rider work. He moved like violence was a language he'd learned young and spoken fluently ever since. Efficient, economical, no wasted motion. Another bandit went down. The rest broke and ran, abandoning the attack in favor of survival. The whole thing took maybe 2 minutes. 2 minutes from appearance to silence. The rider approached the coach slowly, rifle still ready. Grace got her first clear look at him through the shattered window. He was younger than she'd thought, mid-20s at most, with a face that would have been handsome if it wasn't currently set in an expression of cold assessment. His clothes were trail-worn, his boots scuffed, and he had the kind of eyes that had seen too much too soon. "Anyone hurt?" His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much. "The driver's dead," Hutchins called back. "We're shaken, but intact." The stranger dismounted, moving to check Murphy's body. Grace watched him kneel, saw his jaw tighten. "Yeah, he's gone. Anyone else know how to handle a team?" Silence. Grace realized with a sick feeling that without a driver, they were stranded. The stranger must have reached the same conclusion. He looked at the coach, at the dead man, at the horizon where the bandits had disappeared. Whatever calculation he was running, Grace couldn't read the result on his face. "There's a settlement about 15 miles northwest," he said finally. "Dry Creek Hollow. Not much, but it's something. I can get you there, but we leave now. Those boys might come back with friends." "We'd be grateful for the escort," Hutchins said quickly. The stranger's eyes found Grace through the window. She met his gaze, refusing to look away first. Something passed between them. Not recognition exactly, but acknowledgement. 2 people who'd both ended up in places they hadn't quite planned to be. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "You able to ride?" "I can learn." The corner of his mouth twitched. Might have been a smile once upon a time. "That'll have to do. Name's Cole Mercer." "Grace Whitmore. Miss Whitmore." He turned to Hutchins. "Help me get the horses unhitched. We'll ride 3 to a mount. Not comfortable, but it beats walking." They worked quickly, Cole directing with the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed. The strong box that had nearly gotten them killed stayed locked in the coach, apparently not worth dying for after all. Tommy threw up once, then helped without complaint. Hutchins moved like a man who'd just remembered he wanted to live. Grace stood in the sun and tried to process what had just happened. An hour ago, she'd been uncomfortable but safe. Now she was alive because a stranger had decided to intervene, and she was about to ride into territory she knew nothing about with a man whose name was all she had to trust. Cole appeared beside her, leading his paint horse. Up close, she could see the details her initial assessment had missed. The scar that ran along his jawline, the calluses on his hands, the way he stood like someone ready to move in any direction at any moment. He was maybe 10 years younger than her, which shouldn't have mattered, but somehow did. "You ever been on a horse, Miss Whitmore?" "Once. At my cousin's wedding, it walked in a circle while children watched." This time Cole definitely smiled, though it was gone almost immediately. "Well, this'll be different. Copper here is well trained, but he's not used to carrying 2. You'll ride in front of me. I need you to trust the horse and trust me. Can you do that? Grace looked at him. Really looked. Tried to see past the competence and the guns and the way he'd killed 2 men without hesitation. What she found was harder to define, a kind of weariness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. This was a man who'd learned early that the world didn't care about fair and had adjusted accordingly. Do I have a choice? She asked. There's always a choice. Yours is between probable safety and certain death. But yeah, you have to choose it. Honest, at least. Grace appreciated that. Then I trust you, Mr. Mercer. For the next 15 miles at any rate. He helped her mount. His hands were gentle despite their roughness, and then swung up behind her. The horse shifted under the double weight but settled quickly. Grace could feel Cole's presence at her back, solid and warm despite the heat, close enough that she could hear his breathing. Hold on to the saddle horn, he said. If something happens, you stay low and you stay on the horse. Copper will take care of you. What about you? I'll handle whatever comes. They rode out as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, leaving the dead driver and the abandoned coach behind. Hutchins and Tommy followed on the other horses, looking shell-shocked. Grace tried to find a comfortable position and failed. Everything about this was uncomfortable, from the hard saddle to the heat to the knowledge that they were crossing open country with no protection and limited ammunition. The landscape rolled past, beautiful and merciless. Grace had always thought of nature as something benign, the carefully tended gardens of Boston or the pastoral paintings in museums. This wasn't that. This was nature with its teeth showing, indifferent to human survival, shaped by violence and scarcity. You're tense, Cole said behind her. I'm terrified. Good. Fear keeps you sharp. It's overconfidence that gets people killed. They rode in silence for a while. Grace's legs ached, her back protested, and the sun felt like a physical weight pressing down on her. But she didn't complain. Complaining wouldn't change anything, and she'd learned years ago that weakness invited exploitation. What brought you out here? Cole asked eventually. A job. Teaching position in Tucson. Long way from... He paused. Where are you from? Your accent says somewhere east. Boston. He was quiet for a moment. That's a hell of a distance. Yes. Running from something or toward something? Grace stiffened. Does it matter? Not to me, but it might matter to you eventually. She didn't answer. What could she say that wouldn't sound like a confession or a lie? That she'd been engaged to a man who seemed perfect until she'd discovered he wasn't? That she'd made the mistake of confronting him, of threatening to expose his affairs and his embezzlement? That he'd smiled at her across the dinner table and promised to ruin her reputation so thoroughly she'd never work again, never marry, never be anything but a cautionary tale? That she'd believed him because men like him always won? That she'd run because running was the only option left? I'm moving forward, she said finally. That's all that matters. Cole made a sound that might have been agreement. Fair enough. Moving forward is better than most people manage. They crested a rise, and Grace saw something in the distance that might have been buildings or might have been wishful thinking. Cole must have seen her lean forward. That's Dry Creek Hollow, he said. Not much to look at, but it's got water and walls and people who'll help. You'll be safe there tonight. And tomorrow? Tomorrow you figure out how to get to Tucson. Or you don't. Sometimes plans change. Grace thought about her carefully researched plan, the teaching position that might not exist, the respectable new life that was probably a fantasy, the clean break from everything she'd been. It all felt very far away suddenly, less real than the horse beneath her and the man at her back and the settlement slowly taking shape on the horizon. Do you live in Dry Creek Hollow? She asked. Sometimes I move around a lot, go where the work is. What kind of work? Another pause. The kind that needs doing. Cryptic, but Grace let it go. She was too tired to push, and honestly, what did it matter? Cole Mercer had saved her life. Whether he was a drifter or a gunfighter or something else entirely, he'd given her another day of breathing. That counted for something. They reached Dry Creek Hollow as the sun touched the horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful if Grace had the energy to appreciate them. The settlement was small, maybe 24 buildings clustered around a central square, everything built low and sturdy against the wind. It looked like it had been there forever and might disappear tomorrow, temporary and permanent all at once. People emerged as they rode in, hard-faced men and tired-looking women and children who stared with the frank curiosity of people who didn't see strangers often. Cole dismounted first, then helped Grace down. Her legs nearly gave out when her feet hit the ground. "Easy," Cole said, steadying her. "You did good." A man approached, older, with a sheriff's star pinned to his vest and the look of someone who'd stopped being surprised by anything years ago. "Cole? Didn't expect to see you back so soon. Stage got hit 20 miles south. Driver's dead. These three need shelter and a way to continue to Tucson." The sheriff's expression didn't change. "Bandits?" "Yeah. Same group that hit the freight wagon last month, if I had to guess. I dropped 2, but the rest scattered. They'll be back." "Probably." The sheriff looked at Grace, then Hutchins, then Tommy. "Well, we'll figure it out. Come on. Ruth will have food ready, and we've got rooms at the boarding house." They followed him through the settlement, Grace trying not to stumble. Everything felt surreal. The near-death experience, the rescue, the ride through hostile territory, and now this place that seemed to exist outside normal rules of civilization. She was so far from Boston, she might as well be on another planet. The boarding house was run by a woman named Ruth, who took one look at Grace and immediately provided water for washing and a plate of food that was more practical than refined but tasted better than anything Grace had eaten in weeks. Tommy and Hutchins were shown to their rooms. Grace was given a small space at the end of the hall, clean sheets, a window that actually opened, and blessed silence. She sat on the bed and tried to process the day. Failed. It was too much, too big. She'd almost died. She'd been saved by a stranger. She was stuck in a settlement she'd never heard of with no clear path forward. She should have been planning, figuring out next steps, being practical. Instead, she found herself thinking about Cole Mercer, the way he'd moved during the fight, the quiet competence afterward, the unexpected gentleness when he'd helped her dismount. He was nothing like the men she'd known in Boston, with their polish and their pretensions. He was something rawer, more honest, dangerous probably, but real in a way she'd stopped believing people could be. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Cole standing in the hallway, hat in hand. "Just wanted to make sure you're settled," he said. "I am. Thank you." Grace paused. "For everything. I haven't said that yet, but thank you for saving my life." "You're welcome." He shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Sheriff says there might be another stage through in a week or so. Until then, you're stuck here. Town's safe enough if you don't wander off alone." "And you? Will you be here?" Something in his expression shuddered. "I don't stay anywhere long. Thinking I'll head out tomorrow, see if I can track where those bandits went to ground. Someone needs to deal with them before they hit another coach." Grace felt an unexpected stab of disappointment, which was ridiculous. She barely knew this man. That sounds dangerous. Most things worth doing are. They stood there for a moment, neither moving. Grace was aware of how close he was, the way he smelled like leather and gunpowder and horse, the small scar on his jaw that pulled when he almost smiled. "Well," she said finally, "good luck, Mr. Mercer." "Cole. And you too, Miss Whitmore. Hope Tucson turns out to be what you're looking for." He left before she could respond, his footsteps fading down the hallway. Grace closed the door and leaned against it, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. She'd come west to escape one kind of complication, and she had the uncomfortable feeling she'd just stumbled into another. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, she was alive, and that was enough. She crawled into bed without bothering to fully undress, closed her eyes, and let exhaustion pull her under. Her last thought before sleep took her was of Cole's hands, gentle despite their roughness, and the way he'd looked at her like she was someone worth saving. Grace woke to voices arguing below her window. She lay still for a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar room and the quality of light filtering through thin curtains. Everything came back in fragments. The attack, Cole's intervention, the brutal ride through desert that wanted them dead. Her body ached in places she didn't know could ache, muscles protesting the previous day's violence. The voices grew louder. She recognized Ruth's stern tone and a man's voice she didn't know, heated and insistent. "I don't care what the sheriff says. We can't keep taking in strays every time something goes wrong on the Tucson road." "She's a paying guest, Marcus." Her money's as good as anyone's. For how long? You think she's got enough to sit here waiting for a stage that might not come for weeks? Grace sat up, wincing. The truth was, she didn't know how long her money would last. She'd brought what she could, but most of her savings had gone into the journey itself. She'd been counting on the teaching position, on immediate employment and stability. She dressed quickly in yesterday's clothes. They smelled like dust and fear, but were all she had, and made her way downstairs. The boarding house dining room was small, maybe 6 tables, half of them occupied by people eating breakfast with the focused silence of those who worked hard for their meals. Ruth stood behind a counter, arms crossed, facing a lean man with suspicious eyes and the perpetual squint of someone who saw threats everywhere. Their argument stopped when Grace appeared. "Miss Whitmore," Ruth said, her tone carefully neutral. "Coffee? Please." Grace took a seat at an empty table, aware of every eye in the room, tracking her movement. The coffee arrived in a chipped mug, strong enough to strip paint. Grace sipped it and tried not to grimace. She missed the delicate porcelain cups of Boston, the civilized ritual of morning tea. But those belonged to someone else's life now. A plate followed, eggs, some kind of meat, bread that was more practical than refined. Grace ate because her body needed fuel, not because she tasted any of it. Across the room, the suspicious man watched her with undisguised hostility. "Don't mind Marcus," Ruth said quietly, refilling Grace's coffee. "He thinks every stranger is a burden until they prove otherwise." "And how does one prove otherwise?" Ruth smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "By leaving or by staying and making yourself useful. Not a lot of middle ground out here." The word sat heavy in Grace's chest. Making yourself useful. She'd spent 3 years being decorative, playing the role of the perfect teacher, the perfect fiancé, hiding everything real beneath layers of propriety. Useful had never been part of the equation. "I should speak with the sheriff," Grace said, "about transportation to Tucson. He's already out, left before dawn with Cole and a couple others to track those bandits." Ruth paused. "Might be gone a few days." The news landed wrong in Grace's stomach. She told herself it was practical concern. The sheriff was her best chance at arranging travel, but she knew it was more than that. The image of Cole riding into danger again, of him not coming back, bothered her more than it should. "Is there anyone else who might help?" she asked. "Depends what kind of help you need. If it's just about getting to Tucson, you're stuck waiting for the next stage or finding someone willing to make the ride. Neither of which is likely to happen quick." Ruth studied her with the assessing gaze of someone who'd learned to read people for survival. "What's in Tucson?" "A teaching position. At least I hope there is." "You hope?" Grace set down her coffee. "I wrote ahead. Haven't received confirmation, but that doesn't mean much out here, does it? Mail moves slow." "Slower than slow, sometimes not at all." Ruth pulled out a chair and sat, which seemed significant somehow. "You have credentials?" "Yes. I taught at a private academy in Boston for 3 years." "Boston." Ruth said it like the name of a fairy tale place. "That's a long way to come for a maybe." "I had my reasons." "I'm sure you did." Ruth's expression softened slightly. "Look, I'm not trying to pry, but you should know that Tucson's growing fast, which means teaching positions get filled quick. If you had one waiting, someone else might have taken it by now." The thought had occurred to Grace during the long nights of travel, but hearing it stated plainly made it more real, more frightening. "Then I'll find another position," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I'm qualified, I'm willing to work, and I'm already here. That has to count for something." "Maybe." Ruth stood, collecting Grace's empty plate. "In the meantime, you're welcome to stay here. $3 a week, includes meals. I can't promise luxury, but you'll have a roof and regular food. That's $3 a week." Grace did the math quickly. She had maybe enough for a month, 6 weeks if she was careful. After that, she'd be destitute in a territory that ate the weak. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate the hospitality." "Don't thank me yet. You haven't seen what passes for hospitality out here." Ruth left her alone with the remains of her coffee and a growing sense of unease. Grace had always been good at planning, at seeing 3 moves ahead. But this situation had too many variables, too many things outside her control. She was trapped in a settlement she didn't know, waiting for help that might not come, betting everything on a job that probably didn't exist anymore. She thought about Boston, about the life she'd abandoned, about Richard standing in his study, drink in hand, explaining very calmly how he'd destroy her if she breathed a word about his indiscretions, about the choice that hadn't felt like a choice at all, stay and be crushed, or run and hope for something better. At least here, if she failed, it would be her own failure, not someone else's cruelty disguised as love. The morning passed slowly. Grace explored the settlement, which took all of 20 minutes. Dry Creek Hollow was exactly what it looked like. A collection of buildings held together by necessity and stubbornness, existing because someone had found water here once and decided that was enough. There was a general store that sold everything from ammunition to fabric, a blacksmith's forge, a building that served as both saloon and town hall, and a scattering of homes that ranged from solid to barely standing. No school, no church, no bank or telegraph office, or any of the infrastructure Grace associated with civilization. At the edge of town, she found a well with a hand pump and a trough for animals. A woman was there, maybe 30, washing clothes with the methodical exhaustion of someone who'd been doing it too long. 2 children played nearby, their faces dirty and their clothes patched multiple times. "Morning," Grace offered. The woman looked up, her expression guarded. "Morning. You're the one from the attack stage." News traveled fast in small places. "Yes, Grace Whitmore." "Sarah Mitchell." She didn't offer a hand. They were wet and covered in soap. "Heard Cole Mercer brought you in." "He did. Saved our lives, actually." Sarah's expression shifted, something softer breaking through the wariness. "That sounds like Cole. He's got a habit of showing up when things go wrong and making them right again." "You know him well?" "Well, as anyone does, I suppose. He helped my husband build our house 2 years back, didn't ask for much in return. Comes through every few months, stays a week or two, then disappears again." She scrubbed at a stain that probably wasn't coming out. "Good man, even if he doesn't talk much." Grace wanted to ask more but didn't know how without sounding too interested. Instead, she said, "Your children are beautiful." Sarah glanced at the kids with the complicated expression of a mother who loved them, but was also bone-tired. "They're healthy, which is more than some can say. We lost our youngest last winter. Fever took him in 3 days." The casual way she said it, like death was just another hardship to endure, hit Grace harder than she expected. "I'm so sorry." "Yeah, me too." Sarah resumed washing. "You planning to stay in Dry Creek?" "I'm heading to Tucson, as soon as I can arrange transportation." "Tucson's growing. Might be good for someone with your education. We could use a teacher here, though. Town's got 12 children and not one of them can read past basic words. But there's no money for a teacher, no building for a school, just one more thing we need and can't have." The words planted themselves in Grace's mind like seeds. 12 children, no education, no future beyond repeating their parents' hard lives. "What do they do?" Grace asked. "For learning?" "Whatever their parents can teach them, which isn't much. My husband can read a little, write his name. I can do figures well enough to keep accounts, but that's it." Sarah looked at Grace directly. "You taught in a real school?" "Yes, 3 years at a private academy." "Must have been something. Real books, real lessons, not just surviving." Grace thought about the academy, the rigid curriculum, the emphasis on deportment and manners, the way they'd taught girls to be ornamental rather than independent. She'd chafed against it even as she'd enforced it, knowing the system was broken but not knowing how to fix it. It was something, she agreed, but not necessarily better, just different. They talked a while longer, Sarah asking questions about Boston that Grace answered carefully, editing out the parts that hurt too much. Eventually, Grace helped carry the wet laundry back to Sarah's home, a simple structure that was clean and cared for despite its poverty. The children followed, curious about the stranger. The older one, a girl maybe 7, watched Grace with intelligent eyes. "Can you really read?" the girl asked. "I can. Can you?" "A little. Mama taught me letters." Grace knelt to the child's level. "What's your name?" "Emma." "Well, Emma, reading is like magic. Once you learn it, you can go anywhere, meet anyone, learn anything, all from words on a page." Emma's eyes went wide. "Anywhere?" "Anywhere." Sarah watched this exchange with an expression Grace couldn't quite read. Later, as Grace was leaving, Sarah caught her arm. "If you do end up staying," she said quietly, "even for a little while, if you could spend some time with the children, teaching them what you know, we'd find a way to pay you. Not much, but something." Grace nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She'd come west to escape, to start over, to leave behind the weight of other people's expectations. But maybe running away wasn't the same as moving forward. Maybe making herself useful, as Ruth had said, meant more than just survival. She spent the afternoon in her room trying to plan. But planning required information she didn't have. When the next stage would come, whether the Tucson position existed, what her options were if it didn't. Without those answers, planning was just anxiety disguised as productivity. Evening brought the men back from their hunt. Grace heard the commotion from her window and went downstairs to find Cole, the sheriff, and two others in the boarding house common room, trail-worn and grim-faced. Ruth was already pouring coffee and setting out food. Cole's eyes found Grace immediately. Something in his expression eased when he saw her, relief so brief she might have imagined it. "Miss Whitmore," he said, removing his hat. "You're looking better than yesterday. I had the advantage of sleep and a roof. You look like you haven't had either." Accurate assessment. He took the coffee Ruth offered, drank half of it in one long swallow. "We tracked the bandits to a canyon 15 miles south. They've got a camp there, maybe 8 or 9 men total. More organized than we thought." The sheriff, his name was Frank Holloway, Grace had learned, looked older than he had yesterday, the lines in his face deeper. "We can't go after them with 3 men and hope. We'd need twice that number, and this town doesn't have them to spare." "So they just get away with murder?" Grace asked before she could stop herself. Holloway looked at her with tired eyes. "They get away with whatever we can't stop them from doing. That's how it works out here, Miss Whitmore. Justice requires resources we don't have." "But they'll attack another stage, kill more people." "Probably." He said it flat, factual. "And we'll do what we can when we can, and hope it's enough. That's all anyone can do." The resignation in his voice angered Grace in a way she couldn't quite explain. In Boston, problems got solved. You called the police, you went to court, you used the systems in place. But there were no systems here, just people doing their inadequate best against impossible odds. Cole set down his coffee. "I could go back, scout their patterns, figure out when they're vulnerable." "Alone?" Holloway shook his head. "That's suicide." "Maybe. But it's also the only option that doesn't involve waiting for them to kill someone else." They argued about it while Grace listened, frustrated by her own helplessness. She'd always prided herself on her competence, her ability to solve problems. But this problem required skills she didn't have: violence, strategy, the willingness to risk death for strangers who'd never know your name. The meeting broke up without resolution. The other men left. Cole lingered, ostensibly to finish his coffee, but Grace suspected it was more than that. "You're planning to go anyway," she said when they were alone. Regardless of what the sheriff said, Cole didn't deny it. "Someone has to." "And that someone has to be you? I'm the one here. I'm the one who knows where they are." He turned the empty cup in his hands. "And I'm the one who doesn't have people depending on me staying alive. Makes the math simpler." Grace wanted to argue that his life had value beyond utility, that he mattered for more than what he could do. But the words felt too intimate, too revealing of feelings she barely understood herself. "When do you leave?" she asked instead. "Tomorrow at first light." "That's foolish." "Probably." He almost smiled. "You settling in okay here?" The change of subject was deliberate, a door closing on the previous conversation. Grace let it happen. "As well as can be expected. Ruth's been kind. The town is—" She searched for the right word. "Honest, I suppose. Nothing hidden, nothing pretending to be more than it is. That's frontier life, no room for pretense when you're all just trying to survive." He paused. "You hear anything about the next stage?" "Nothing definite. Could be a week, could be longer." "And you're still planning to go to Tucson when it comes?" Grace heard the real question underneath. "I don't know," she admitted. "Yesterday I was certain. Today less so. There's nothing waiting for me there except a job that probably doesn't exist. But there's nothing for me here either." "There could be." The words hung between them. Cole looked like he regretted saying them immediately, but he didn't take them back. "I met a woman today," Grace said carefully. "Sarah Mitchell. She told me the town has 12 children and no teacher, that they're growing up without education, without options. That's true. She asked if I might teach them, even temporarily." Cole watched her with those two old eyes. And what did you say? I said I'd think about it. Grace moved to the window, looking out at the settlement in the fading light. In Boston, I taught girls how to be decorative, how to manage households they'd never own, how to be charming without being interesting. I hated it, but I was good at it because that's what the job required. This would be different. Yes, this would be teaching children how to survive, how to have more than their parents did, how to make choices. She turned to face him. That feels important in a way my old job never did, but it also feels impossible. There's no school building, no supplies, no guarantee I can even make a difference. Most worthwhile things feel impossible at the start. Cole stood, moving to join her at the window, close enough that she could feel the heat from his body, smell the trail dust and leather. Sarah's right that this town needs a teacher, but you should know what you'd be signing up for. Life here is hard. It breaks people who aren't ready for it, and there's no shame in deciding you'd rather try your luck in Tucson. Is that what you'd do? Me? I'd stay. But I'm used to hard. I grew up with it. You didn't. Grace thought about that, about the assumptions people made based on her accent, her clothes, her past. They saw someone refined and fragile, someone who'd shatter under pressure. They didn't know about the 3 years of lying to herself and everyone else, about maintaining perfect composure while her life crumbled from the inside, about the strength it took to walk away from everything familiar and bet on an uncertain future. You don't know what I'm used to, she said quietly. Cole studied her face like he was seeing her properly for the first time. No, he agreed. I suppose I don't. They stood there as darkness gathered outside. Two people who'd accidentally collided and didn't quite know what to do about it. Grace was acutely aware of every inch of space between them, the way her heart rate picked up when he was near, the irrational part of her brain that wanted to close that distance and see what happened. But she'd just escaped one catastrophic romantic mistake. Getting tangled up with a man 10 years younger who rode into danger like it was a calling seemed like a different kind of disaster waiting to happen. You should get some sleep, Cole said, stepping back. You've had a rough couple of days. So have you. I'm used to it. He collected his hat. I'll be gone before you wake up tomorrow. But when I get back, if I get back, we can talk more about your options, if you want. I want. The words came out more intense than Grace intended. Cole's expression did something complicated. Then I'll make sure I come back. He left before Grace could respond to that. She stood alone in the common room, listening to his footsteps fade, feeling like something significant had just happened, but not quite able to name what. That night, sleep came hard. Grace lay in the dark thinking about children who couldn't read, about bandits who'd kill without consequence, about a young man riding alone into danger because no one else would, about the life she'd planned versus the life she was living. Somewhere around midnight, she made a decision. Not about staying or leaving, that was still too big, too permanent, but about tomorrow, about what she could do with the time she had while she waited for transportation that might not come. She could teach. For a week or a month or however long she was stuck here, she could give those 12 children something they didn't have. It wouldn't solve anything permanently, but maybe that was okay. Maybe small acts mattered even when they didn't fix everything. The thought settled something in her chest, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since leaving Boston. Morning arrived too early. Grace dressed and went downstairs to find Ruth already working in the kitchen. I'd like to speak with Sarah Mitchell, Grace said, and any other parents who might be interested in their children receiving instruction. Could you help arrange a meeting? Ruth's eyebrows rose. You're staying. I'm teaching. While I'm here, there's a difference. Not much of one, once you get started. But Ruth smiled, genuine warmth breaking through her usual guardedness. I'll spread the word. Give me till this afternoon to round people up. The meeting happened in the saloon, the only space large enough to hold everyone. Grace counted 8 adults, including Sarah, all of them looking at her with varying degrees of hope and suspicion. She recognized the pattern from her engagement party when Richard's business associates had assessed her value as a potential wife. But this time the stakes felt more honest. She stood in front of them, trying not to feel like a specimen under examination. I understand your children need education. I can provide that, at least temporarily. I can't promise how long I'll be here, but while I am, I'm willing to teach. A man in the back, Marcus, the one who'd complained about strays, spoke up. What's it cost us? Whatever you can afford. I'm not asking for charity, but I'm also not looking to burden families who are already struggling. Pay what seems fair. And what do you know about teaching frontier children? They're not Boston debutantes. Grace met his challenge directly. No, they're not. They're children who deserve better than ignorance and limited futures. I may not know everything about life out here, but I know how to teach reading, writing, mathematics, and critical thinking. Those skills work the same everywhere. Another parent, a woman with calloused hands, asked, "Where would you teach? We don't have a building." I noticed an empty structure near the well. What is that? Old storage shed, Sarah said. Hasn't been used in years. Could it be cleaned out? Made serviceable? The parents looked at each other, a silent conversation happening. Finally, Sarah's husband, a quiet man Grace hadn't met yet, spoke. We could make it work. Wouldn't be fancy, but it'd have walls and a roof. Then that's our school. Grace felt momentum building, the pieces clicking together. I'll need basic supplies. Slates if possible, chalk, paper when we can get it. Books would be helpful, but we can work without them initially. The general store might have some of that, Ruth offered. And I've got an old primer somewhere. My sister sent it years ago for kids I never had. They discussed logistics, hours, days, which children would attend, what constituted payment. It wasn't organized or efficient, but it was honest. People offering what they had, asking for what they needed, trying to build something better. By the time the meeting ended, Grace had commitments from all 8 families. 12 children, ages 5 to 13. Classes would start in 3 days, giving time to prepare the space and gather supplies. As people filed out, Marcus approached her. Up close, he looked older than she'd thought, weathered by sun and hardship. I was wrong about you, he said without preamble. Thought you were just another Easterner who'd run at the first sign of trouble. But maybe you've got more spine than that. It wasn't quite an apology, but Grace accepted it as close as she'd get. I'm not running. Not yet, anyway. Good. He almost smiled. My daughter Annie's smart as hell, but she's got no future if she can't read and figure. You teach her that, and I'll owe you more than money can cover. After he left, Sarah hugged Grace quickly, fiercely. Thank you. You don't know what this means. But Grace thought maybe she did. She'd spent 3 years teaching things that didn't matter to people who'd never struggle. This was different. This was real need meeting real skill. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was a life that made sense in a way nothing had for a long time. That afternoon, Grace inspected the old storage shed with Sarah and 2 other women. It was rough, dirt floor, gaps in the walls, cobwebs in every corner, but it had potential. They worked until sunset, sweeping and scrubbing, making lists of what was needed. Grace fell into bed exhausted but satisfied. She'd done something concrete, something that mattered. Tomorrow she'd start gathering supplies and planning lessons. The day after, she'd meet her students. Tucson felt very far away, like something that belonged to someone else's future. 3 days passed in focused activity. The storage shed transformed into something resembling a classroom. Grace wrote out basic lessons on sheets of butcher paper begged from the general store. She organized the space, limited as it was, into a teaching environment, and she tried not to think about Cole, riding alone into danger, but she thought about him anyway. Wondered if he was alive, if he was hurt, if he'd encountered the bandits or managed to avoid them. The uncertainty gnawed at her in quiet moments, a low-grade anxiety she couldn't quite dismiss. On the 4th morning, Grace stood in her makeshift classroom and waited for students who might not come. She'd prepared lessons, had materials ready, but there was no guarantee any of it would work. The children might hate her, might resist learning, might prove that her Boston teaching methods were useless out here. At 8 o'clock, Emma arrived first, dragging her younger brother. Then Annie, Marcus's daughter, suspicious but present. The others followed in clusters until all 12 were accounted for, grubby, curious, completely unlike the well-scrubbed students Grace had taught before. Good morning, Grace said, and her voice only shook a little. My name is Miss Whitmore, and I'm going to be your teacher. A boy in the back, maybe 12, crossed his arms. What if we don't want to learn? Then you'll sit quietly while the others do. But I think you'll find that learning is more interesting than you expect. She started with names, having each child introduce themselves and say one thing they wanted to learn. The answers ranged from practical, I want to read the labels at the store, to ambitious, I want to know about places that aren't here. Grace wrote each goal on her makeshift board, giving them weight and legitimacy. Then she taught them their first lesson. Not reading or mathematics, but something more fundamental, that their voices mattered, that their questions deserved answers, that education wasn't about memorizing facts, but about learning to think. By the end of that first hour, even the skeptical boy in the back was leaning forward, engaged despite himself. Grace dismissed them at noon, watching them scatter back to their regular lives. She felt wrung out and energized all at once, the particular exhaustion of doing something that mattered. Sarah appeared with food and water. How'd it go? Better than expected, worse than ideal. About right, I think. They sat together in the teaching space, eating simple food and talking about the children, their strengths, their challenges, what they'd need going forward. It felt good to talk shop with someone who understood the stakes. You're really doing this, Sarah said. Actually building something here. Grace looked around the rough space that would never be mistaken for a proper school, but was functioning as one anyway. I'm trying. We'll see if it lasts. That evening, riders came into town fast and loud. Grace heard the commotion and went out to find Cole's paint horse being led by one of the men who'd gone with him on the tracking expedition. Her heart stopped. "Where's Cole?" she demanded, not caring how it sounded. The rider, a young man named Tom, looked grim. "He's coming, but he's hurt. We ran into the bandit sooner than expected. There was shooting. Cole took a bullet in the shoulder." Grace's world narrowed to that single piece of information. Cole was hurt. Cole might be dying. Cole might already be dead, and they were just preparing her. How bad? She was already moving toward Ruth's boarding house, where they'd bring him. Bad enough. He rode most of the way back himself, but he's lost blood. Needs a doctor, and we don't have one. I'll help. Grace didn't know what she could do, but standing still wasn't an option. They brought Cole in 20 minutes later, barely conscious, his shirt soaked through with blood. Grace's stomach turned, but she pushed past the nausea. This wasn't the time for weakness. Ruth took charge immediately, having them lay Cole on a table in the kitchen. Get me hot water, clean cloth, and whatever whiskey we've got. Grace, you've got steady hands? Yes. Good. You're assisting. What followed was the longest hour of Grace's life. Ruth worked with the calm efficiency of someone who'd patched bullet wounds before, probing for the slug, cleaning the injury, stitching torn flesh. Grace held Cole down when he thrashed, applied pressure when told, tried not to think about how much blood there was. Cole drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to curse the pain, sometimes gone completely. Once, his eyes found Grace's face and he tried to say something, but the words came out garbled. Save your strength, she told him, squeezing his hand harder than she meant to. You're going to be fine. She didn't know if that was true, but saying it felt necessary. Finally, Ruth tied off the last stitch and stepped back, wiping her hands. That's all I can do. The rest is up to him and luck. If infection sets in, we'll lose him. If not, he might pull through. What can I do? Grace asked. Keep him cool. Make sure he drinks water when he's conscious. Watch for fever. Ruth looked at her with something like sympathy. And pray if you're inclined that way. Grace wasn't, particularly, but she'd sit vigil anyway. They moved Cole to a room upstairs, Ruth's own room, given up without complaint. Grace pulled a chair beside the bed and settled in for what she knew would be a long night. Cole's fever came on strong just after midnight. Grace had been watching his chest rise and fall, counting breaths to keep herself awake, when she noticed the change. His skin went from pale to flushed in what felt like minutes, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. When she touched his face, the heat nearly made her pull back. Ruth! She didn't care who she woke. Ruth, he's burning up. Ruth appeared in the doorway within seconds, carrying a lamp and more clean cloth. She pressed her hand to Cole's forehead and swore under her breath. Get me cold water from the well, as much as you can carry, and bring up that bottle of willow bark tea from the kitchen shelf. Grace ran. Down the stairs, out into the night where the air was finally cool after the day's oppressive heat. Her hands shook as she worked the pump, filled the bucket, carried it back up. Some sloshed over the side, soaking her skirt. She didn't notice. They worked in grim silence, Ruth directing while Grace followed orders. Cold compresses on his forehead, his chest, anywhere the fever concentrated. Willow bark tea forced between his lips when he was conscious enough to swallow, which wasn't often. His body fought them, thrashing against the cooling cloths, muttering things Grace couldn't understand. Will he make it? Grace asked when she couldn't stand the silence anymore. I don't know. Ruth wrung out another cloth, replaced the one on Cole's chest. I've seen men survive worse. I've seen men die from less. There's no predicting it. There has to be something else we can do. There isn't. This is frontier medicine, Grace. We do what we can with what we have and hope it's enough. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it isn't. The bluntness should have frightened Grace, but instead it steadied her. No false comfort, no empty promises. Just truth, harsh and clean. They took turns through the night, one sleeping while the other kept watch. Grace's shift came around again near dawn. She sat in the chair that was starting to feel like hers, watching Cole's face in the lamplight. Without the usual wariness he carried, he looked younger, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen him. She found herself studying the details she'd been too careful to notice before. The scar on his jaw, the calluses on his hands, the way his hair fell across his forehead. There was a gentleness to his features that the hardness of his expression usually hid. She wondered what he'd been like before life had taught him to be guarded. If he'd ever been soft, or if he'd been forged hard from the beginning. You don't get to die, she told him quietly. Not after dragging me into this. You made me care about this place, about these people. You don't get to leave me here to figure it out alone. Cole didn't respond. Couldn't, probably. But Grace felt better for saying it. The fever broke just before sunrise. One moment he was burning, the next his temperature was dropping, sweat cooling on his skin. Grace checked and rechecked, afraid to trust it, but Ruth confirmed what she was seeing. He's through the worst of it, Ruth said, and the relief in her voice told Grace how worried she'd actually been. Doesn't mean he's out of danger, but his body's fighting back now. Grace slumped in her chair, exhaustion hitting all at once. She'd been running on fear and determination for hours. Now that the immediate crisis had passed, she felt hollowed out. You should sleep, Ruth said. Real sleep, in a bed. I'll watch him. I'm fine here. Grace. Ruth's tone was gentle but firm. You've got students coming in 3 hours. You need rest, or you'll be useless to everyone. The students. Grace had completely forgotten about her second day of teaching. The thought of standing in front of those children, pretending everything was normal while Cole lay unconscious upstairs seemed impossible. But impossible wasn't an excuse anymore. She'd learned that. Wake me if anything changes, Grace said, standing on legs that didn't quite want to support her weight. I will. Grace made it to her room and collapsed onto the bed, still wearing yesterday's clothes, blood-stained and wrinkled. Sleep took her under before she could think about anything else. She woke to someone shaking her shoulder. Disoriented, Grace sat up to find Sarah standing beside the bed. It's past 8, Sarah said. The children are waiting at the school. I told them you might not be coming after last night, but Emma insisted I check. Grace's mind struggled to catch up. 8 o'clock, school, children waiting. How's Cole? She asked, splashing water on her face from the basin. Ruth says he's sleeping. Fever's still down. She thinks he'll wake up sometime today. Relief and exhaustion warred in Grace's chest. He was alive. That had to be enough for now. She changed clothes quickly, her hands fumbled with the buttons, and headed to the makeshift school. The children were there, all 12 of them, sitting in the spaces they'd claimed yesterday. Emma jumped up when Grace walked in. Miss Whitmore, we heard Mr. Mercer got shot. Is he going to die? 11 other pairs of eyes fixed on Grace, waiting for an answer. She thought about lying, about offering false comfort, but these children lived with death too close to pretend it didn't exist. He's very sick, she said honestly, but he's fighting, and Ruth is taking good care of him. We'll know more in the next few days. Annie, Marcus's daughter, spoke up. My uncle got shot 2 years ago. Took him 3 months to recover, but he did. Mr. Mercer's tough. He'll make it. Yeah, another boy added. Mr. Mercer saved my dad when our barn caught fire last year. He wouldn't let a little bullet stop him. Grace realized these children knew Cole in ways she didn't. He was part of their community, had been for longer than she'd understood. The stories came out in fragments, Cole helping with harvests, Cole tracking a wolf that had been killing livestock, Cole teaching someone's older brother to shoot properly. He mattered here, not just as a protector, but as someone woven into the fabric of daily life. Then we'll hope you're right, Grace said. Now, let's begin. Yesterday we talked about why learning matters. Today we're going to start with the foundation of everything, the alphabet. Teaching while exhausted and worried proved harder than Grace expected. She kept losing her train of thought, had to ask children to repeat themselves, found her gaze drifting to the window as if she could see the boarding house from here. But the children were patient with her, more patient than she deserved. They worked through letters and sounds, basic reading exercises, simple arithmetic. Emma absorbed everything like she was starving for it. Annie asked sharp questions that made Grace work for answers. The skeptical boy from yesterday, his name was James, grudgingly participated, clearly trying not to show interest but failing. When she dismissed them at noon, Grace felt wrung out but oddly centered. Teaching grounded her, gave her something concrete to hold on to when everything else felt uncertain. She went straight to Ruth's boarding house, found Cole awake, propped against pillows, looking pale and drawn but conscious. Ruth was spooning broth into his mouth with the determination of someone who wouldn't accept refusal. "You look terrible," Grace said from the doorway. Cole's eyes found her, a spark of his usual sharpness returning. "You should see the other guy." "I'd rather not, actually. I've had enough violence to last a while." Ruth stood, gathering the empty bowl. "He needs rest, but he can have visitors for a few minutes. Don't tire him out." She left them alone, closing the door most of the way. Grace moved to the chair she'd occupied all night, suddenly unsure what to say. All the fear and worry from the past 12 hours sat heavy between them. "Heard you helped Ruth patch me up," Cole said. His voice was rough, weak. "Thank you. You saved my life. Seemed only fair to try returning the favor." "We're not keeping score, are we?" "Maybe we should be. You're ahead by quite a bit." Cole almost smiled, but it turned into a wince. "The bandits?" "Gone, according to Tom. You and the others drove them off. Sheriff thinks they'll move to different territory now that you made this area too hot for them." "Good." He shifted, trying to find a more comfortable position, and went pale with the effort. Grace stood without thinking, adjusting his pillows, helping him settle. Her hands lingered on his shoulders longer than necessary. When she realized what she was doing, she pulled back. "Sorry, I don't mean to—" "It's fine." Cole caught her hand before she could retreat completely. His grip was weak but deliberate. "Grace, I need to tell you something." The seriousness in his tone made her nervous. "You should rest. Whatever it is can wait." "No, it can't. I've been thinking about it since I woke up. Might not have the courage later." He took a breath that looked painful. "When I was out there, bleeding, thinking I might not make it back, the thing that bothered me most wasn't dying. It was the thought of you not knowing." "Knowing what?" "That I'm glad you ended up here, in Dry Creek Hollow. That I'm glad I was the one who found you on that road." His eyes met hers, unflinching despite the vulnerability in his words. "That somewhere in the last week, you stopped being a responsibility and started being something else. Something I don't have a name for yet." Grace's heart did something complicated in her chest. She should pull her hand away, should deflect this before it became real. She was 35 to his 25. She was planning to leave. She'd just escaped one romantic disaster and had no business walking into another. But she didn't pull away. "Cole." "I know," he said quickly. "I know all the reasons this doesn't make sense. I know you're planning to go to Tucson. I know I'm too young, too rough around the edges, too much of everything you left Boston to escape. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know." The honesty of it hit Grace harder than any declaration of love from her past. Richard had courted her with poetry and flowers and carefully calculated romance. This was something raw, more real, terrifying in its simplicity. "You're not too young," she said, and was surprised to find she meant it. "Or too rough. You're just—" She struggled for words. "You're just more honest than I'm used to." "Is that good or bad?" "I don't know yet." Grace looked at their joined hands. "I came west to run away from complications, from feelings that made me stupid and vulnerable. I told myself I'd be smarter this time, more careful." And then you showed up and saved my life, and made me care about this town and these children, and—" She stopped, afraid to finish the sentence. "And what?" Cole's voice was quiet, careful. "And you," Grace admitted. "I care about you. I don't want to. It would be easier if I didn't, but I do." Silence stretched between them. Cole's thumb moved against her palm, a small gesture that sent heat through her entire body. "So where does that leave us?" he asked. "I honestly don't know." Grace forced herself to be practical, even though her heart was arguing for something else entirely. "You're recovering from a gunshot wound. I'm supposed to be temporary here. We barely know each other. Every rational part of my brain says this is a mistake." "What about the irrational parts?" Grace laughed, surprising herself. "They're being extremely unhelpful at the moment." Cole smiled, genuine this time despite the pain it clearly caused. "Well, we don't have to figure it all out today. I'm not going anywhere for a while. You're stuck here at least until the next stage. Maybe we just see what happens?" It was too reasonable a suggestion to argue with. And if Grace was honest, she didn't want to argue. She wanted to see what happened when you stopped running and started paying attention to what was actually in front of you. "All right," she said. "We'll see." Ruth appeared in the doorway, eyebrows raised at their joined hands, but saying nothing about it. "He needs to sleep now. You can visit again this evening if he's strong enough." Grace stood, reluctantly letting go of Cole's hand. "Rest. Heal. Don't do anything stupid like dying on me." "Yes, ma'am." Cole's eyes were already closing, exhaustion pulling him under. Grace left the room feeling unsteady, like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She'd come to Dry Creek Hollow by accident, stayed out of practicality, and now found herself tangled up in something she hadn't planned for and didn't know how to navigate. The smart thing would be to leave. Take the next stage when it came, go to Tucson or somewhere else. Start over without complications. But Grace was starting to realize that the smart thing and the right thing weren't always the same. The next few days fell into a pattern. Grace taught in the mornings, visited Cole in the afternoons, planned lessons, and worried in the evenings. Cole recovered slowly, too slowly for his own patience. She'd find him trying to sit up fully or move his shoulder, cursing when it didn't work the way he wanted. "You were shot," Grace reminded him during one such attempt. "Recovery takes time." "I don't have time. There's work needs doing. The work will wait. Your body won't if you push too hard." They argued about it regularly, a friction that felt almost comfortable in its familiarity. Cole hated being inactive. Grace hated seeing him in pain, and neither of them knew how to admit they just wanted an excuse to be in the same room. The school grew in unexpected ways. Parents started lingering after dropping off their children, asking Grace questions about their progress. Sarah brought her oldest daughter, 15 and supposedly too old for schooling, and asked if Grace would tutor her separately. Marcus donated lumber for actual desks, grudging about it, but determined his daughter would have proper furniture. The settlement itself began to shift around the new reality of having a school. Small changes, barely noticeable unless you were looking for them. Children walked around with books borrowed from Grace's limited collection, practicing their letters on anything that would hold chalk. Parents discussed their children's education with a seriousness that suggested they'd started believing in possibilities they hadn't before. Grace felt it settling around her, this accidental life she'd fallen into. It wasn't what she'd planned, but it fit in ways her Boston existence never had. Here, what she did mattered in concrete, measurable ways. She could see the impact of her work in Emma's widening vocabulary, in Annie's mathematical reasoning, in James's reluctant admission that reading was not completely terrible. 2 weeks after Cole's injury, Grace was cleaning up after class when Sarah appeared with news. "Stage is coming through tomorrow. Making a stop here for supplies before heading to Tucson." The words landed like stones. Tomorrow. Transportation to Tucson, to the life she'd originally planned, to everything that made logical sense. "Oh," Grace said, which was inadequate but all she could manage. "You don't look happy about it." "I don't know what I am about it." Grace set down the slate she'd been holding. "I should be relieved. This was always temporary. I have a profession, Tucson has opportunities. Staying here long-term doesn't make practical sense." But I've started something here, with the school, with the children. Leaving feels like abandoning them." Sarah studied her with knowing eyes. "Is it just the school you'd be abandoning?" Grace didn't answer, didn't need to. "Cole's up and moving around now," Sarah said carefully. "Still weak, but getting stronger. He's been asking about you. About when you're teaching, what your schedule is. Like he's trying to memorize it before you leave." The image of Cole tracking her movements, trying to hold on to something before it disappeared, made Grace's chest ache. "I need to think," she said. Thinking's good, but don't think yourself out of something that could be good just because it's not what you planned. Sarah left Grace alone with that advice and too many thoughts competing for attention. She went to see Cole that evening, found him standing by the window of his room. Ruth had finally let him have his own space back, looking out at the settlement. He turned when she entered, leaning slightly on the windowsill for support. "Heard about the stage," he said. "News travels fast. Always does in small towns." He gestured to the chair. "May? Sit if you want. Fair warning, I'm not good company tonight." Grace sat. "Neither am I." They were quiet for a while, the kind of silence that felt full rather than empty. Cole stayed at the window, and Grace thought about how much stronger he looked compared to 2 weeks ago. Still too thin, still favoring his injured shoulder, but alive and healing. She'd help make that happen. "Are you going?" Cole asked finally. "I don't know. I should. I came out here for a teaching position, for a fresh start somewhere with actual infrastructure and opportunity. But I've already started something here. The children are making progress. There are parents asking about continuing education, about expanding what we teach, and She stopped, unsure how to finish. Cole turned to face her fully. "And what?" Grace made herself meet his eyes. "And I don't want to leave you, which is ridiculous because we barely know each other, and you'll probably move on soon anyway. And I'm too old to be making decisions based on feelings instead of logic." "You're not too old." Cole moved away from the window, crossing to where she sat. He knelt, awkward with his injury, so they were at eye level. "And I'm not moving on. I thought I would, after this. Thought I'd drift to the next job, the next town, the same way I always have. But something's different this time." "What's different?" "You. This school. The way the town feels like it's waking up to something better. I want to be part of that. I want to help build it." He paused. "I want to build it with you." Grace felt tears threatening and blinked them back. That's a lot of wanting from someone who almost died 2 weeks ago. Dying makes you clear about what matters. His hand found hers. "You matter, Grace. What you're doing here matters. And if you decide to go to Tucson, I'll understand. I'll wish you well and mean it. But if you stay, if you take a chance on this place, on these people, on me, I'll do everything I can to make sure you don't regret it." It was too much honesty, too much vulnerability from a man who'd learned to guard himself. Grace wanted to protest that he couldn't promise that regret wasn't something anyone could prevent. But the look in his eyes stopped her. He meant it, every word. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Last time I trusted someone, last time I let myself believe in a future with another person, it ended badly, really badly, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to survive that again." "What happened?" Cole asked quietly. Grace hadn't told anyone the full story. Not Ruth, not Sarah, not even herself most days. But sitting here with Cole, his hand warm in hers, the truth wanted out. "I was engaged to a man who seemed perfect on paper, successful, charming, from a good family. Everyone told me how lucky I was. I believed them." She looked at their joined hands rather than his face. But he wasn't who he pretended to be. He was having affairs, embezzling from his business partners, lying about everything that mattered. When I found out, when I confronted him, he threatened to destroy my reputation if I said anything. And he could have. In Boston society, a man's word against a woman's, there's no contest. Cole's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "So I ran," Grace continued, "packed what I could, bought a ticket west, and left everything behind. My job, my friends, my entire life. Because staying meant letting him win, and I couldn't do that. But running felt like losing too." "That's not losing," Cole said fiercely. "That's surviving. That's being smart enough to know when to walk away from something poisonous." "Maybe. But it left me. I don't know how to trust my judgment anymore. I thought I knew him. I was completely wrong. What if I'm wrong again?" Cole was quiet for a moment. "You want honesty?" "Always." "You might be. I might disappoint you. We might try this and have it fall apart 6 months from now. I can't promise perfect because I don't know how to be perfect." He shifted, his grip on her hand tightening. "But I can promise I won't lie to you. I won't pretend to be something I'm not. What you see is what you get. A man who's too young for you by society's standards, who doesn't have much to his name, who makes his living doing dangerous work. But I'm honest, I keep my word, and I care about you enough to let you go if that's what you need." Grace felt something shift inside her chest. Richard had promised her everything: wealth, status, comfort, respect. He delivered lies wrapped in pretty words. Cole was promising her nothing except himself, unvarnished and real. "I need time," she said, "to think about this clearly. The stage leaves tomorrow afternoon. That gives me until then." "Take the time you need." Cole stood slowly, wincing. "Whatever you decide, I won't hold it against you." Grace left his room and walked into the evening air. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of red and gold. She could hear children playing somewhere, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the ordinary sounds of a community going about its life. This place was rough, unfinished, barely holding on. It had no concert halls or museums, no fine restaurants or social seasons. It offered hardship and uncertainty and a future that could fail in a dozen different ways. But it also offered something Grace had never had in Boston, a sense of purpose that came from being genuinely needed rather than decoratively wanted. She walked to the edge of town, to where the desert opened up into endless horizon, stood there thinking about paths not taken and choices that couldn't be undone. In Boston, she'd been Grace Whitmore, respectable schoolteacher, perfect fiancée, a woman who colored inside all the lines society drew. She'd been miserable. Here, she was still Grace Whitmore, but a different version. Rougher, more honest, teaching children who desperately needed what she could offer. Building something real instead of maintaining something false. The question wasn't whether Tucson would be better. The question was whether she was brave enough to choose the life she'd accidentally found over the one she'd carefully planned. That night, Grace barely slept. She lay in bed running through arguments and counter-arguments, making mental lists of pros and cons, trying to logic her way to a decision. But the answer didn't come from logic. It came from somewhere deeper, a knowing that bypassed rational thought entirely. She wanted to stay, not because it was smart or practical or what anyone expected, but because this felt like where she was supposed to be, doing what she was supposed to do with people who saw her for who she actually was. Morning came too fast. Grace dressed carefully, trying to look like someone who'd made a momentous decision and was at peace with it. Failed completely, but made the attempt anyway. She taught her morning class in a daze, the children's voices reaching her as if through water. When she dismissed them, Emma lingered behind. "Are you leaving on the stage today?" the girl asked quietly. Grace looked at her student, this bright, curious child who'd absorbed every lesson like she was starving for knowledge. Emma represented all 12 of them, all the potential that would be wasted if Grace abandoned what she'd started. "No," Grace said, and felt the rightness of it settle in her bones. "No, I'm staying." Emma's face lit up with pure joy. She hugged Grace quickly, fiercely, then ran off to tell the others. Grace sat alone in the makeshift classroom, letting the weight of her decision sink in. She was staying, in Dry Creek Hollow, building a school, building a life, building something with Cole Mercer that might work or might fail, but was worth trying. She should have felt terrified. Instead, she felt free. The stagecoach arrived at 2:00, dust rising in its wake like a proclamation. Grace watched it from the window of the boarding house, her packed bag sitting on the bed behind her, a lie she'd prepared that morning before her conversation with Emma, before she'd known for certain what her answer would be. She should go down there, tell the driver she wouldn't need passage. Make it official. Instead, she stood frozen, watching Hutchins emerge from the coach, along with 2 other passengers she didn't recognize. The driver began checking the horses, calling out for water and fresh provisions. The whole scene had a practiced efficiency that suggested this stop would be brief. "You're not going." Grace turned to find Ruth in the doorway, arms crossed but expression unreadable. "No," Grace said, "I'm not." "Does Cole know?" "Not yet. I wanted to be sure before I told him, before I told anyone." Ruth nodded slowly. "And you're sure now?" Grace looked at the bag she'd packed out of habit more than intention, then back at the window where the coach sat waiting for passengers who wouldn't come. "Yes, I think I am." "Good." Ruth's expression softened into something almost maternal. "This town needs you, those children need you, and whether you're ready to admit it or not, Cole needs you too. I'm not sure anyone should need me that much. I have a habit of disappointing people. We all do. It's called being human." Ruth moved into the room, sat on the edge of the bed. You want my advice? Stop waiting to be perfect before you let yourself be happy. Perfect doesn't exist, especially not out here. But happy, that's possible if you're brave enough to reach for it. The words settled into Grace like seeds finding soil. She'd spent so long trying to be flawless, trying to meet impossible standards, that she'd forgotten happiness wasn't a reward for perfection. It was a choice you made despite imperfection. I should tell him, Grace said, before the stage leaves. He's in his room, been pacing like a caged animal all morning, checking the window every 5 minutes. Boy's driving himself crazy, wondering if you'll go or stay. Grace collected the bag. She'd unpack it properly later, and made her way down the hall to Cole's room. She knocked twice, heard his muffled response, and entered to find him standing by the window in almost the exact position she'd just vacated in her own room. He turned when she entered, his eyes going immediately to the bag in her hand. His expression closed down, carefully neutral, but she saw the hurt underneath. "So you're going," he said. Not a question. "No." Grace set the bag down. "I packed it this morning out of habit, before I was certain, but I'm certain now." Cole's carefully maintained composure cracked. "You're staying?" "I'm staying. The school needs continuity. The children are making progress. And I—" She crossed to him, close enough to see the pulse jumping in his throat. "I want to see what this could be. Between us. I'm terrified and probably making another huge mistake, but I want to try anyway." For a moment, Cole just stared at her like he was afraid to believe it. Then he was moving, pulling her into his arms, carefully because of his shoulder, and holding her like she was something precious he'd thought he'd lost. "You're sure?" His voice was rough against her hair. "This life is hard, Grace. Harder than anything you knew in Boston. I can't promise it'll get easier." "I don't need easy. I need real. I need to matter." She pulled back enough to see his face. "And I think I matter here. To those children. To this town. To you. You do. More than you know." Cole's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "I love you. I know it's too soon. I know we barely know each other, but I love you anyway. Have since you told me you could learn to ride a horse, standing there in the desert like you'd fight the whole frontier if you had to." Grace felt tears threatening and didn't try to stop them. "I love you too. It's terrifying and illogical and probably going to complicate everything, but it's true." Cole kissed her then, gentle at first and then deeper when she responded. It was nothing like the careful, calculated kisses Richard had bestowed. This was messy and honest and tasted like hope. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Grace was crying and laughing at the same time. "We're going to have to tell people," she said, practical even now. "They already know. This town doesn't keep secrets." "Then we're going to have to deal with their opinions about the age difference, about propriety, about—" Cole stopped her with another kiss. "Let them talk. I don't care what anyone thinks as long as you're here." A knock at the door interrupted them. Ruth's voice came through, amused and knowing. "The stage is leaving. I told the driver you wouldn't need passage, Grace. Hope that was all right." "It's perfect," Grace called back. "And thank you." They listened to Ruth's footsteps retreat, then the sounds of the stagecoach preparing to depart. Grace moved back to the window, Cole beside her, and watched it pull away. Watched her carefully planned escape route disappear into the desert, leaving her here with the choice she'd made and all its uncertain consequences. "No regrets?" Cole asked quietly. Grace threaded her fingers through his. "Ask me in a year." He laughed, the sound surprised and genuine. "Fair enough." The news of Grace's decision spread through Dry Creek Hollow with the speed of wildfire. By evening, Sarah had appeared at the boarding house with an invitation to dinner. Marcus had donated more lumber for expanding the school, and 3 parents Grace hadn't even met yet were asking about enrolling their children. But the real work started the next morning when Grace arrived at the school to find Cole there, hammer in hand, examining the structure with a critical eye. "What are you doing?" she asked. "You're still recovering. I'm healed enough for light work, and this building needs reinforcement if it's going to survive winter." He gestured to the walls. "These gaps will let in wind and rain. We need to patch them, add insulation, maybe build a proper door instead of this curtain situation. We don't have money for materials. We have lumber from Marcus and nails from the general store. Ruth convinced old Henderson to donate them. Between that and what people can scrounge up, we can make this place weatherproof. Cole set down his hammer and turned to face her fully. If you're going to do this, let's do it right. Build something that lasts. Grace felt warmth spread through her chest. This was Cole's way of showing commitment, not through words, but through action, through building something permanent when his whole life had been about moving on. All right, she said. Let's build it right. Over the next 3 weeks, the school transformed. Cole worked whenever his strength allowed, teaching Grace basic carpentry as they went. Other men from town joined in during evenings and weekends. Marcus with his expertise in construction, Sarah's husband Tom handling the harder physical labor, even Sheriff Holloway contributing a few hours when he could spare them. The women contributed too. Ruth organized a collection of books from various households, creating a small lending library. Sarah sewed curtains for the windows they'd installed. Another woman Grace had barely spoken to, a quiet widow named Elizabeth, donated a small stove for heating once winter arrived. Grace watched the community come together around this project and felt something shift in her understanding of what a town could be. In Boston, institutions existed because money made them possible. Here, things existed because people decided they mattered enough to build them with their own hands. The children watched the transformation with growing excitement. Emma took it upon herself to organize the borrowed books, creating a cataloging system that was surprisingly sophisticated for a 7-year-old. James, the previously skeptical boy, helped carry materials, his resistance to learning completely abandoned now that he could see concrete results. Annie cornered Grace one afternoon, concern written across her face. Miss Whitmore, some of the kids are saying you and Mr. Mercer are courting. Is that true? Grace had known this conversation would come eventually. Yes, it's true. Does that bother you? Annie considered this with the seriousness of a child trying to navigate adult complications. My pa says you're too old for him, that it doesn't look right. And what do you think? I think, Annie paused, choosing her words carefully. I think you make Mr. Mercer smile more, and he makes you less scared looking, so maybe it doesn't matter what age you both are? Grace felt her throat tighten with emotion. That's very wise, Annie. Also, if you get married, does that mean you'll stay forever? Because I really want to keep learning. The practical concern underneath made Grace smile. I'm staying regardless of what happens with Mr. Mercer. I made a commitment to you and the other students. I keep my commitments. Good. Annie's relief was palpable. Because you're the best teacher we've ever had. You're actually the only teacher we've ever had, but still. The school officially reopened in its improved form on a Monday morning, 6 weeks after Grace had made her decision to stay. The structure now had real walls, glass windows, a solid door, and enough space for twice the current number of students. Grace had organized the interior into teaching stations, with the borrowed books displayed prominently and a real chalkboard. Another donation, this one from a family 3 towns over who'd heard about the school and wanted to contribute. She stood at the threshold that first morning, looking at what they'd built, and felt pride swell in her chest. This was hers in a way nothing in Boston had ever been, not because she owned it, but because she'd helped create it from nothing. Cole appeared beside her, his shoulder finally moving without that careful hesitation that had marked his recovery. You did it. We did it, Grace corrected. This whole town did it. But you're the reason we tried. Before you came, everyone just accepted that there wouldn't be a school, that their kids would grow up ignorant. You made us believe something different was possible. Grace leaned into him slightly, a public display of affection that would have scandalized her old self. I didn't do it alone. No, but you started it. The children began arriving, their excitement obvious as they took in the transformed space. Emma ran her hand along the new bookshelves like they were made of gold. James tested the sturdiness of the new desks, nodding approval. Annie immediately claimed a seat near the front and waited impatiently for class to begin. Grace taught that day with a clarity of purpose she'd never experienced before. These children were learning not just because it was required or expected, but because they wanted to, because they could see how it would change their futures. That made all the difference. Lunchtime brought an unexpected visitor. A well-dressed man on a fine horse, clearly not from Dry Creek Hollow. He introduced himself as Henry Carver, a representative from the Territorial Education Office. I've heard about your school, he said, looking around the building with assessing eyes. Word spreading about the teacher from Boston who's educating frontier children with nothing but determination and borrowed materials. Grace felt defensive instincts rise. Is there a problem? On the contrary, I'm impressed. Carver pulled out a document from his saddlebag. The territory is expanding its education initiative. We're looking to establish schools and settlements that show promise. Dry Creek Hollow wasn't on our list, but after hearing about what you've accomplished here, I think it should be. What does that mean exactly? Cole had appeared at Grace's side, his posture protective. It means official recognition, a small salary for Miss Whitmore, funding for supplies and materials, potential for expansion. The territory wants to support educators who are making a real difference. Carver extended the document to Grace. This is a provisional contract. If you're interested, we can make this school official, give it legitimacy and resources. Grace took the paper with shaking hands. Official recognition meant stability, meant she wouldn't have to worry about funding or materials. It meant her work here would be recognized as legitimate rather than just a temporary arrangement. It also meant commitment. No more pretending this was a temporary stop on the way to somewhere else. Can I have time to review this? She asked. Of course. I'll be in the area for another week. Send word when you've decided. Carver tipped his hat. For what it's worth, Miss Whitmore, what you're doing here matters. The territory needs more teachers like you. After he left, Grace stood holding the contract, trying to process what had just happened. Cole read over her shoulder, his presence warm and steady. This is what you wanted, isn't it? He asked. Official teaching position? Salary? Recognition? I thought so. Back in Boston, this is exactly what I was looking for. Grace looked at the school, at the children visible through the windows, at the town spreading out beyond. But now I'm not sure I want the territorial government involved. What if they have requirements that don't fit what these children need? What if they try to standardize everything and strip away what makes this work? Then you negotiate. Set terms that protect what matters while accepting help where it's useful. Cole turned her to face him. Grace, you don't have to decide right now, and you don't have to decide alone. This school belongs to the whole community. Maybe they should have a say in whether it becomes official. The suggestion was so sensible that Grace wondered why she hadn't thought of it herself. A town meeting? A town meeting. Let everyone weigh in on what they want for their children's education. They held the meeting 3 days later in the saloon, the only space large enough for the crowd that showed up. Grace was startled to see nearly every adult in Dry Creek Hollow present, plus a few from neighboring homesteads who'd traveled specifically for this discussion. She stood in front of them, the contract in her hands, and explained the offer. Official recognition, funding, salary, territorial oversight. She laid out the advantages and the potential complications, trying to present both sides fairly. The question is whether we want outside involvement, she concluded. Whether the benefits outweigh the loss of local control. Marcus spoke first, his voice carrying across the room. I say we take it. My Annie's learning things I never could have taught her. If the territory wants to pay for that and provide materials, I'm not too proud to accept help. Sarah disagreed. But what if they send inspectors who decide our school isn't good enough? What if they try to replace Miss Whitmore with someone they choose? We built this ourselves. I don't want to hand control to bureaucrats who've never set foot here. The debate continued for over an hour, passionate and occasionally heated. Grace listened to people argue about their children's futures, about autonomy versus resources, about what kind of town they wanted Dry Creek Hollow to become. Sheriff Holloway finally stood, commanding immediate attention through sheer presence. Seems to me we're arguing about the wrong thing. The question isn't whether we accept territorial help. The question is whether we trust Miss Whitmore to make the right decision for these children. The room went quiet. Grace, Holloway continued, using her first name for the first time since they'd met. You've proven yourself here. You came as a stranger, stayed when you could have left, built something real when you could have just collected a salary elsewhere. You care about these kids, about this town. So I say we let you decide. You read that contract, you negotiate whatever terms you think are fair, and you tell us whether to accept or reject it. We'll back your decision either way. There was a moment of silence, then people began nodding, murmuring agreement. The vote, when it came, was nearly unanimous. Grace would decide, and the community would support her choice. After the meeting, Grace sat in the empty saloon with Cole, the contract spread on the table between them. That was unexpected, she said. Was it? You've earned their trust. I've been here 3 months. That's nothing. 3 months of showing up every day. 3 months of caring about their children. 3 months of choosing to stay when leaving would have been easier. Cole's hand covered hers. That's not nothing, Grace. That's everything. She read the contract carefully over the next 2 days, marking sections that concerned her, noting clauses that would need modification. Then she drafted a response, not acceptance or rejection, but a counteroffer that would preserve local autonomy while accessing territorial resources. She wanted funding for materials, but not curriculum mandates. She wanted official recognition, but not bureaucratic oversight. She wanted support without control. When Carver returned, Grace presented her terms. He read them with raised eyebrows, then surprised her by laughing. Most teachers beg for less responsibility, not more. You're asking for full autonomy in exchange for meeting basic educational standards. Yes, these children need education that fits their reality, not some distant administrator's idea of what frontier children should learn. I'm willing to demonstrate results, to prove this approach works, but I won't sacrifice effectiveness for bureaucratic convenience. Carver studied her with new respect. You know, the territorial office needs teachers with your combination of competence and backbone. If you succeed here, there will be opportunities to expand to help establish other schools. I'm not interested in opportunities elsewhere. I'm interested in making this school work. Fair enough. Carver collected the documents. I'll present your counter-proposal to the Education Committee. Can't promise they'll accept all your terms, but I'll argue in your favor. You're exactly the kind of teacher the frontier needs. Stubborn, capable, and too committed to quit. He left with promises to return with a response within the month. Grace watched him go and felt something settle in her chest. Whether the territory accepted her terms or not, she'd done this her way. Set boundaries, fought for what mattered, refused to compromise on principles just for the sake of security. Richard would have told her she was being foolish, that you took what was offered and counted yourself lucky. But Richard had been wrong about most things. That evening, Grace and Cole took a rare walk beyond the settlement's edge, into the desert that had terrified her 3 months ago, and now felt almost familiar. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of orange and gold that would have seemed too dramatic if she'd seen them in a painting, but felt exactly right in reality. You did good today, Cole said, standing up for what you believe in. I learned from watching you. You don't compromise when it matters. I also got shot being stubborn. Not sure I'm the best role model. Grace bumped her shoulder against his. You survived being shot. That counts for something. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of quiet that only came when two people had moved past the need to fill every moment with words. Grace thought about how far she'd come, literally and figuratively, from the woman who'd boarded a stagecoach in Kansas City, running from one life without a clear plan for the next. I've been thinking, Cole said eventually, about the future, about what we're building here. And I think I'm ready to stop drifting, to put down roots. He paused, clearly working up to something. Sheriff Holloway's getting old, talking about retiring in a year or two. He asked if I'd be interested in taking over. Grace stopped walking, turned to face him. A sheriff? Cole, that's permanent. That's commitment. Yeah, it is. His eyes met hers, steady and sure. I'm ready for permanent, ready for commitment, to this town, to this life. He took her hand. To you, if you'll have me. Grace's heart did something complicated. This wasn't quite a proposal, not yet, but it was close. It was Cole saying he wanted a future, a real one, that included her in every plan he made. I'll have you, she said, voice thick with emotion. Stubborn, gunshot, too young for me, you. I'll have all of it. Cole pulled her close, kissed her thoroughly in the fading light, and Grace felt herself surrendering to the impossibility of this. A life she hadn't planned, a man she hadn't expected, a future that made no logical sense but felt more right than anything ever had. They walked back to town as stars began appearing overhead, talking about possibilities and plans, about what they'd build together, and how they'd face the inevitable challenges. It was practical and romantic all at once, which seemed fitting for who they both were. When they reached Ruth's boarding house, they found the whole town gathered in the street, lanterns lit, food spread on makeshift tables. Sarah caught sight of them and grinned. Surprise! We decided you two needed a proper celebration. For the school, for Cole's recovery, for, she gestured vaguely, for all of it. Grace looked at Cole, who seemed as surprised as she was, then at the faces surrounding them, people who'd started as strangers and had somehow become family. Marcus raising a glass in her direction, Emma waving enthusiastically, Sheriff Holloway nodding approval, Ruth watching with maternal satisfaction. This was community, not perfect, not always easy, but real and honest and present. "Speech," someone called out, and others took up the cry. Grace felt panic rise. She'd never been good at spontaneous speaking, but Cole's hand found hers, steadying her. "I came here by accident," she started, her voice carrying in the quiet that had fallen. "Running from one life without a clear plan for the next. I thought I was just passing through. The Dry Creek Hollow was a temporary stop on the way to somewhere else." She paused, looking around at the settlement that had become home. "But you didn't let me pass through. You gave me a purpose, gave me children to teach, and a community to belong to. You built a school with your own hands because you believed education mattered. You welcomed a stranger and made her family." Her voice cracked slightly. "So thank you for seeing something in me I didn't see in myself, for giving me a reason to stay when leaving would have been easier, for being exactly the kind of people worth building a life with." The cheering that followed was loud and genuine, and Grace found herself pulled into hugs and handshakes, people thanking her when she should have been thanking them. Cole stayed close, his presence a constant anchor in the chaos of celebration. Later, when the food was eaten and the crowd had dispersed into smaller conversations, Grace found herself sitting with Sarah and Ruth, watching Cole talk with Marcus and the sheriff. "You're happy," Sarah observed. "Actually happy, not just content." Grace considered denying it, then decided honesty served better. "Yeah, I am. It terrifies me, but I am." "Good." Ruth topped off Grace's coffee from a pot someone had kept warm. "You deserve it. After whatever you ran from in Boston, you deserve something good." "I'm not sure deserve has anything to do with it. I think I just got lucky." "Luck is showing up and doing the work even when it's hard," Sarah said. "You did that. Don't diminish it by calling it luck." Grace let the words sink in, let herself believe them. She had shown up. She had done the work. And somewhere along the way, she'd built a life worth living. The celebration continued late into the night, children eventually falling asleep on parents' shoulders, adults lingering over conversations and coffee. Grace watched it all with the odd double awareness of being fully present while also observing from a distance, cataloging details she wanted to remember. This moment, these people, this feeling of belonging, she'd spent so long looking for it in the wrong places that she'd almost missed it when it appeared in the most unlikely location imaginable. Cole found her as the last guests were leaving, pulled her close under the stars that seemed impossibly bright out here, far from city lights. "Ready for tomorrow?" he asked. Tomorrow meant returning to normal, teaching, building, the everyday work of making a life in this hard place. It meant challenges and setbacks, moments of doubt and difficulty, but it also meant more nights like this, more celebrations of small victories, more slow progress toward something better. "Yeah," Grace said, leaning into his warmth. "I'm ready." They stood together in the quiet that followed the celebration. Two people who'd found each other by accident and chosen each other on purpose, and Grace felt something she'd thought she'd lost forever. Hope for a future that didn't require her to be anything other than exactly who she was. The Territorial Education Committee's response arrived on a cold morning in late November, delivered by a rider who looked half frozen from the journey. Grace took the envelope with trembling hands, not from the cold but from the weight of what the answer might mean. Cole stood beside her in the school, their school now, in every way that mattered, watching as she broke the seal. The children wouldn't arrive for another hour, giving them privacy for whatever news this brought. Grace read in silence, her expression giving nothing away. Then she read it again, slower, making sure she understood correctly. "Well?" Cole asked when he couldn't stand the suspense anymore. "They accepted. All of it." Grace looked up from the letter, something between shock and triumph in her eyes. "Every term I proposed, full autonomy, funding for materials, official recognition without bureaucratic oversight. They even added a salary that's higher than I requested." "Grace, that's—" Cole pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in a moment of unguarded joy. That's everything you wanted. It's everything we wanted, she corrected when he set her down. For the school, for the children, this makes it real, Cole. Permanent. He kissed her then, thorough and unhurried, the kind of kiss that spoke of futures and promises. When they broke apart, Grace was flushed and Cole was grinning like a fool. We should tell people, she said, trying to smooth her hair back into place. They already know. Sarah saw the rider come in. By now the whole town's waiting for news. He was right. When they stepped outside, people were gathering in the street despite the cold, their breath forming clouds in the morning air. Grace held up the letter, and the cheer that rose could probably be heard in the next county. That evening brought another celebration, smaller than the last, but no less genuine. Parents pressed Grace's hand and thanked her with voices thick with emotion. Marcus actually smiled, which Sarah later claimed was worth documenting as a historical event. Emma hugged Grace so hard she nearly knocked the wind out of her. Does this mean you'll never leave? Emma asked, her face pressed against Grace's side. It means I have every reason to stay, Grace said carefully. She'd learned not to promise forever to children. Life was too unpredictable. But she could promise intention, commitment, presence. Emma seemed satisfied with that answer. She ran off to tell the other children, who'd formed their own celebration in the corner, convinced this news somehow meant extended recess privileges. Cole found Grace later after the crowd had thinned and people had returned to their homes. She was sitting on the steps of the school, looking at the building they'd transformed together. You're thinking too hard, he said, settling beside her. I can see it on your face. I'm thinking about how strange life is. 6 months ago, I was in Boston, engaged to a man I thought I knew, teaching at a school I hated, trapped in a life that looked perfect and felt empty. She leaned against his shoulder. Now I'm here, in the middle of nowhere with you, doing work that actually matters. And I'm happier than I've ever been. Strange isn't the word I'd use. Lucky, maybe. Is it luck when you choose it? When you decide to stay instead of run, to try instead of give up? Cole was quiet for a moment. I think luck is getting the chance to choose. What you do with it, that's character. Grace turned to look at him, this man who'd saved her life and somehow saved everything else too without trying. When are you going to ask me? Ask you what? Don't play innocent. We both know where this is heading. The question is whether you're waiting for some perfect moment that's never going to come. Cole laughed, surprised and genuine. You want to talk about this? Here? Now? Why not? Perfect moments are overrated. I prefer honest ones. He took her hand, studying it like he could read their future in the lines of her palm. I was waiting until spring. Thought I'd do it proper. Get a ring, plan something romantic, give you the proposal you deserve. I don't want proper or romantic. I want real. Grace squeezed his hand. And I want you, if you're offering. I'm offering. Have been since the day you decided to stay. Just didn't want to push, didn't want you to feel trapped by circumstances, or... Grace stopped him with a kiss. I don't feel trapped. I feel free in a way I never did when my life was carefully planned and perfectly controlled. So yes, Cole Mercer. Whatever you're asking, the answer is yes. His smile started slow and built into something that transformed his whole face. You're supposed to let me actually ask the question. Then ask. Cole stood, pulled her to her feet, and took both her hands in his. No ring, no prepared speech, just the two of them in the cold November air outside a school they'd built together. Grace Whitmore, will you marry me? Will you build a life here, in this rough place with its hard winters and uncertain futures? Will you take a chance on a man who's too young for you by society's standards and has nothing to offer except his whole heart? Yes, Grace said, and felt the rightness of it in her bones. To all of it, yes. They stood there grinning at each other like children until the cold finally drove them inside. There was no ring to formalize it, no announcement to make since the whole town would know by morning anyway. Just the two of them, a decision made, a future committed to. Grace fell asleep that night thinking about how she'd expected her life to look. Carefully controlled, socially appropriate, emotionally safe. And how wrong she'd been about what would actually make her happy. The best things, she was learning, came from the choices that scared you most. Winter settled over Dry Creek Hollow with a harshness that tested everyone. Grace had thought Arizona was all desert heat, but the nights dropped below freezing and the wind cut through everything. The school's new walls and the donated stove made it habitable, but barely. She learned to dress in layers, to always keep her coffee hot, to plan lessons that kept children moving so they didn't freeze while sitting still. Cole installed additional insulation and weather stripping, working through cold that made his old injury ache. The town pulled together in the way frontier communities did, sharing resources, checking on neighbors, surviving through collective effort. Grace's first real test came in January when a blizzard hit without warning. She'd dismissed the children early when the first flakes started, thinking it was just a light snow. Within an hour, visibility dropped to nothing, and the temperature plummeted. 3 children hadn't made it home before the storm hit full force. Emma, James, and a younger boy named Timothy were trapped somewhere between the school and their houses, lost in whiteout conditions. Cole organized a search party immediately, but Grace saw the worry in his eyes. People died in storms like this, especially children who didn't know to stay still and wait for help. "I'm coming with you," Grace said, already putting on every warm layer she owned. "Grace, you're not built for this. Stay here where it's warm." "Those are my students out there. I'm coming." They stared at each other for a long moment, wills clashing. Then Cole nodded, accepting what he should have known from the start. Grace didn't back down when it mattered. The search was brutal. Wind-driven snow stung exposed skin. Every breath felt like inhaling knives, and visibility was so poor Grace lost sight of Cole when he was 10 feet ahead. She called for the children until her voice went raw, listening desperately for any response. They found Timothy first, huddled behind a building, crying but alive. Cole carried him back to safety while Grace and Sheriff Holloway continued searching. An hour passed. 2. Grace's hands and feet went numb, and she knew hypothermia wasn't far behind, but she couldn't stop. Wouldn't stop. She almost walked past them. Emma and James had found shelter in an abandoned shed, huddled together for warmth. Emma was unconscious, James barely responsive. Grace gathered them both close, her own body heat all she had to offer, and screamed for help. Cole appeared out of the snow like an answer. Between them, they got the children back to town and into Ruth's boarding house, the closest shelter. Ruth had hot water ready, blankets warming by the fire. They worked through the night, treating frostbite and hypothermia, fighting to keep body temperatures from dropping further. Emma finally woke just before dawn, disoriented and scared, but alive. James never fully lost consciousness, but remained dangerously cold for hours. By morning, both children were out of immediate danger, though James would lose 2 fingers to frostbite. Grace sat with them while they slept, exhaustion and relief warring in her chest. She'd almost lost them. 2 children who trusted her, who showed up to learn every day, who had families and futures and so much potential. The weight of that responsibility crashed over her all at once. Cole found her there hours later, still keeping vigil. "They're going to be okay. You saved them. I almost got them killed. I dismissed class too early, didn't check the weather properly, didn't—" "Grace," Cole knelt beside her chair. "You made the best decision you could with the information you had. That's all anyone can do. And when it went wrong, you went into a blizzard to bring them home. You didn't hesitate, didn't protect yourself first. You did what a good teacher does. You took care of your students." James lost his fingers. James is alive. That's what matters. Cole took her cold hands in his. "Out here, we don't get to prevent every tragedy. We just do our best and hope it's enough. Today it was. Today everyone came home." Grace wanted to argue, wanted to hold on to the guilt because it felt like the responsible thing to do. But Cole was right. This was frontier life, hard, unforgiving, full of dangers that couldn't always be prevented. What mattered was showing up anyway, doing the work anyway, caring anyway. The incident changed something in Grace's relationship with the community. Before, she'd been the teacher from Boston, competent but still somewhat separate. After the blizzard, after risking her own life for their children, she became one of them in a way that went deeper than residence or employment. Sarah hugged her the next time they met, fierce and wordless. Marcus nodded respect when she passed him on the street. Even the people who'd been skeptical about her relationship with Cole seemed to soften, recognizing that love took different forms and age gaps mattered less than commitment and character. The wedding happened in March, when winter finally loosened its grip and early wildflowers began appearing in unlikely places. They'd planned something small and simple, but the community had other ideas. Someone donated fabric for a dress. Someone else built an arch decorated with desert flowers. Ruth organized food that would feed twice the expected guests. The morning of the wedding, Grace stood in her room at the boarding house, looking at herself in the small mirror. The dress was simple but beautiful, made to fit her by Sarah and two other women who'd spent weeks on the project. Her hair was pinned up in a style that was practical but somehow still elegant. She looked different than she had 6 months ago. Older in some ways, younger in others. The careful polish of Boston was gone, replaced by something more honest. There were lines around her eyes from squinting against the sun, calluses on her hands from helping with school construction, a confidence in her posture that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she wanted. Sarah appeared in the doorway, Emma beside her. "You ready?" "I think so. Is Cole?" "He's been ready for an hour. Boys pacing a trench in the ground outside the church." Grace smiled at that. The church was barely worthy of the name, just a building someone had suggested they use since it was the largest covered space aside from the saloon. But it would do. Everything out here was about making do with what you had and finding it was enough. Emma held out a small bouquet of wildflowers, carefully arranged. "I picked these this morning. For you." Grace took them with a lump in her throat. "They're perfect. Thank you, Emma." The walk to the church was short, but Grace felt like she was traveling years rather than yards. She thought about the woman who'd boarded a stagecoach in Kansas City, running from shame and heartbreak. That woman had been scared, uncertain, hiding behind propriety because she didn't know what else to do. The woman walking toward Cole Mercer was still scared sometimes, still uncertain about the future. But she wasn't hiding anymore. She was present, engaged, choosing her life instead of letting it happen to her. Cole stood waiting at the makeshift altar, wearing clothes that were clean but not fancy, his hair combed back and his expression somewhere between nervous and joyful. When he saw Grace, his face transformed into something that made her breath catch. She'd been loved before, or thought she had. Richard had said the words, had performed the gestures expected of a devoted fiancé. But he'd never looked at her the way Cole did, like she was the answer to questions he hadn't known to ask. Sheriff Holloway performed the ceremony. Having been deputized for the purpose by some territorial authority, Grace didn't quite understand. The words were traditional, but the meaning felt revolutionary. Two people choosing each other despite age differences, despite coming from different worlds, despite every practical reason they shouldn't work. When Holloway asked if anyone objected, there was a moment of silence. Then someone in the back, Grace never found out who, said clearly, "Not a chance. These two belong together." Laughter rippled through the gathered crowd, warm and accepting. Cole's vows were simple. "Grace, I promise to build with you, fight beside you, and love you honestly every day we have. I can't promise perfect because I don't know how to be perfect, but I can promise present, committed, and real. That's what I offer. That's what I am." Grace's vows came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. "Cole, I promise to choose you every day. Not because it's easy or convenient, but because you're worth choosing. You showed me what it means to be brave, to care about something more than safety. I promise to be that person, the one who shows up, who does the work, who builds a life worth living with you." They exchanged rings that Cole had somehow acquired, simple silver bands that fit perfectly. When Holloway pronounced them married, Cole kissed her thoroughly enough that someone whistled and children giggled. Grace didn't care. She was married. To a man she loved, in a town that had become home, building a life that made sense in ways her carefully planned Boston existence never had. The celebration lasted into the night, food and music and dancing in the street. Grace danced with Cole, then with Sheriff Holloway, then with Marcus, who was surprisingly graceful despite his gruff exterior. Children ran wild, drunk on sugar and late hours. Adults laughed and told stories and celebrated love in a place where joy had to be deliberately cultivated against constant hardship. Late in the evening, Grace found herself standing with a group of women, Sarah, Ruth, Elizabeth, and others who'd become friends rather than just acquaintances. They were talking about the future, about plans to expand the school, about the possibility of bringing in more families now that education was available. "You changed this town," Ruth said, slightly drunk on celebration and whiskey. "Before you came, we were just surviving. Now we're actually living, building something that might last." "I didn't do it alone," Grace protested. "No, but you started it. That matters." Sarah raised her glass. "To Grace Mercer, the teacher who taught us more than reading and arithmetic, who taught us to want more, expect more, be more. They drank to that, and Grace felt tears threatening. She'd spent so long feeling inadequate, like she was failing at the life she was supposed to want. But maybe she'd just been aiming at the wrong target. Maybe success wasn't about meeting other people's expectations. Maybe it was about finding work that mattered, and people who saw you clearly and still chose to keep you. Cole found her as the celebration was winding down, guests departing with well wishes and knowing smiles. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Mercer?" The name still felt strange, but Grace thought she could get used to it. "Where's home exactly?" "Well, that's the thing." Cole looked almost shy. "I might have been working on something, as a wedding present." He led her through the dark streets to the edge of town, to a lot Grace had assumed was empty. Except it wasn't empty anymore. A small house stood there, rough and unfinished but undeniably real. Just one room so far, but with the frame for more visible in the moonlight. "It's not much yet," Cole said, "but I've been building it in the evenings with help from some of the other men. Thought we should have our own place, somewhere that's ours." Grace walked through the structure, seeing it not for what it was but what it would become. Walls they'd finish together. Windows they'd install. A life they'd build piece by piece with their own hands and their own vision. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. They spent their wedding night in that unfinished house, wrapped in blankets against the cold, talking about plans and possibilities. Where they'd put the kitchen, how many rooms they'd eventually need, whether they'd have children of their own, or if the students would be enough. "I never thought about children before," Grace admitted. "In Boston, it was expected, but not something I actively wanted. Now, I'm not sure. We don't have to decide tonight, or this year, or ever, if that's what you want." Cole pulled her closer. "This life, you, me, the school, this town, that's already more than I ever expected to have. Everything else is extra." Grace thought about that. About how she'd been taught that a woman's worth came from marriage and children, from meeting specific milestones in a specific order. But out here, those rules didn't apply the same way. Out here, worth came from contribution, from showing up and doing the work and caring about the community. Whether she and Cole had children or not, whether their family stayed small or expanded, they were building something that mattered. That was enough. Spring turned to summer, and the school year ended with a small ceremony where Grace handed out certificates of completion to students who'd progressed beyond their starting levels. Emma could now read at a level that would put her ahead of most frontier children. James had discovered a talent for mathematics that surprised everyone, including himself. Annie was already talking about becoming a teacher, about helping Grace educate the next wave of students. The Territorial Education Office sent an inspector in July, a stern woman named Margaret Stone who'd been teaching for 30 years and had seen every trick students and teachers could devise. Grace was nervous about the inspection, worried that her methods wouldn't meet official standards. Stone spent 3 days observing, asking questions, reviewing student work. On the final day, she sat Grace down for a formal assessment. "Miss Whitmore, apologies, Mrs. Mercer. I've inspected 17 frontier schools in the past year. Most of them are disasters. Teachers who don't care, students who don't learn, communities that see education as a burden rather than an investment." Grace braced for criticism. "Your school is none of those things," Stone continued. "Your students are engaged, progressing at remarkable rates, and genuinely curious about learning. Your teaching methods are unorthodox but effective, and this community clearly values what you're providing." She closed her notebook. "I'm recommending you for the Territorial Teaching Excellence Award, and I'm asking if you'd be willing to help train other frontier teachers in your methods." The recognition was gratifying, but the request made Grace pause. "I'm needed here. The school is still developing, the students need consistency. I'm not asking you to leave. I'm asking you to share what you've learned. Perhaps a summer training session, where teachers from other settlements could come here, observe your methods, learn from your example." Stone's stern expression softened slightly. "You've created something special, Mrs. Mercer. It would be selfish to keep it to yourself." Grace discussed it with Cole that evening as they worked on their house, which now had walls and a roof and was starting to feel permanent. "What do you think?" she asked. "Is it too much? Too soon?" "I think you're scared of success the same way you were scared of failure," Cole said, measuring a board for cutting. "You've proven you can do this. Why not help others do it too?" "Because I barely feel like I know what I'm doing half the time. I'm making it up as I go. adapting Boston methods for frontier realities. I'm not an expert. You're the closest thing we have to one. Cole set down his tools, gave her his full attention. Grace, you've spent your whole life doubting yourself because other people told you that you weren't enough. Maybe it's time to believe you are. The words hit harder than Grace expected. He was right. Even after everything she'd accomplished, she still carried that voice from Boston, Richard's voice, her colleagues' voices, society's voice, telling her she was inadequate. But she wasn't inadequate. She was doing work that mattered, teaching children who needed her, building a community that valued education. That wasn't nothing. That was everything. All right, she said, I'll do it. One summer training session. We'll see how it goes. The first teacher training happened in August. 6 teachers from various frontier settlements gathering in Dry Creek Hollow for a week of observation and instruction. Grace was terrified the first day, convinced she'd be exposed as a fraud. Instead, she found herself energized by sharing what she'd learned: how to teach multi-age classrooms, how to adapt lessons when materials were limited, how to engage parents and build community support, how to balance academic rigor with practical frontier needs. The teachers absorbed everything, asked brilliant questions, shared their own challenges and solutions. By the end of the week, Grace had learned as much as she'd taught, and the visiting teachers left with notebooks full of ideas and renewed commitment to their own students. Stone had been right. What Grace had built in Dry Creek Hollow was worth sharing. Years passed the way they do in places where seasons matter more than dates. The school expanded, adding a second room and eventually a third. Enrollment grew as families moved to the area specifically because education was available. Grace trained teachers every summer, her methods spreading across the territory, her name becoming synonymous with frontier education excellence. Cole became sheriff when Holloway retired, bringing his combination of fairness and competence to the role. The town grew around them, new businesses, new families, a telegraph office that connected them to the wider world. Dry Creek Hollow transformed from a struggling settlement into a real community with infrastructure and identity. Grace and Cole's house grew too, rooms added as needed, filled with books and furniture built by hand and memories accumulated slowly. They never had children of their own, a decision they made together without regret. The students were their children, hundreds of them over the years, each one carrying pieces of what Grace taught into their own futures. Emma became a teacher herself, taking over the primary grades when Grace focused on older students in teacher training. James opened a store, using the mathematics Grace had taught him to build a successful business. Annie married a farmer from a neighboring settlement, but returned every summer to help with teacher training, her sharp questions and practical wisdom making her invaluable. On Grace's 45th birthday, the town threw a celebration that doubled as a 10-year anniversary of the school's founding. There were speeches and tributes, students from every year sharing how education had changed their trajectories, parents thanking her for giving their children opportunities they'd never had. Grace stood in front of them, these people who'd become family, and tried to find words adequate to the moment. 10 years ago, I arrived in Dry Creek Hollow by accident, she started. I was running from a life that looked perfect but felt empty, looking for something I couldn't even name. I thought I was just passing through. She paused, looking at Cole in the front row, at Emma beside him, at the faces of students and parents and friends. But you didn't let me pass through. You gave me a purpose when I was lost. You let me build something meaningful when I'd forgotten what meaning felt like. You took a stranger and made her family. Her voice thickened with emotion. I came here to teach, but you taught me more. You taught me that home isn't a place you're born. It's a place you choose and that chooses you back. That family isn't just blood. It's the people who show up when things are hard and celebrate when things are good. That worth isn't measured by how well you meet other people's expectations, but by how honestly you contribute to your community. She had to stop, overwhelmed. Cole came forward, took her hand, steadied her the way he'd been doing for 10 years. I don't know what my life would have looked like if that stagecoach hadn't been attacked, Grace continued. If Cole hadn't shown up at exactly the right moment, if I'd made it to Tucson in that teaching position that probably didn't exist, but I know it wouldn't have been this. It wouldn't have been building a school with my own hands, watching children discover they're capable of more than they imagined, training teachers who spread what we've learned across the territory. She looked directly at Cole. It wouldn't have been falling in love with a man who saw me clearly and loved me anyway, who built a life with me that's nothing like I planned but exactly what I needed. The celebration continued late into the night, but Grace found herself stepping away, walking to the school that had started everything. It was dark and quiet now, the students long gone, but she could feel their presence in every corner, years of learning, struggling, growing, years of mattering. Cole found her there, because of course he did. He always knew when she needed him. Having regrets? He asked, joining her on the steps. Not even one. Grace leaned against him, comfortable and certain. I was just thinking about that woman who showed up here 10 years ago, how scared she was, how lost. And now? Now I'm found, not in some dramatic, complete way. I still have bad days, still doubt myself sometimes, still mess up regularly. But I know who I am. I know what I'm building and why it matters. That's not something I had before. Cole was quiet for a moment. You gave me that too, you know. Before you, I was just drifting, going where the work was, never staying anywhere long enough to matter. You made me want to stay, want to build something permanent. They sat together in the darkness, two people who'd collided by chance and chosen each other on purpose, watching their town settle into sleep. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The wind carried the smell of sage and dust. The stars overhead were impossibly bright, the way they only got this far from civilization. Grace thought about the life she'd imagined in Boston. Safe, respectable, emotionally contained. She thought about the life she'd accidentally found. Rough, honest, full of work that mattered, and people who cared. There was no contest. This life, with all its hardships and uncertainties, was the one worth living. Not because it was easy, but because it was real. Not because it was perfect, but because it was hers. Ready to go home? Cole asked eventually. Grace stood, took his hand, and let him lead her through the dark streets to the house they'd built together. Tomorrow she'd teach again, train again, contribute to the slow work of building a community that valued knowledge and growth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, new opportunities to make a difference. But tonight, she was simply Grace Mercer. Teacher, wife, community member. A woman who'd run from one life and stumbled into another, who'd chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier, who'd built something meaningful with her own hands and heart. She'd conquered the frontier not with force, but with courage. Not by being perfect, but by being present. Not by having all the answers, but by showing up anyway, doing the work anyway, caring anyway. And that, Grace had learned, was enough. More than enough. It was everything.